Hi guys, I'm Woodcraft Hamster and welcome back to my beginner's guide to carving series. Now today I want to talk to you about a subject that most of you will probably consider quite boring and maybe slightly irrelevant, and I'd like to change your minds on that, and that's about safety in carving. Now especially if you're a newcomer and you're not used to using knives, obviously there is a risk that you may end up cutting yourself, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know any wood carver, I've never met a wood carver that hasn't cut themselves fairly frequently. I don't care how careful you are, it does happen. And really, to me, it's about minimising what happens if you do. I cut myself on a regular basis and they tend to be very small nicks, very shallow, nothing particularly dangerous. And that's because I like to try and practice safe carving. Now, obviously, if you don't practice safe carving, the potential is that if you do cut yourself, it could be something put my teeth back in, pretty serious, and that's what you want to avoid. So what I want to do, I want to show you just a few things today and share a few thoughts of mine on carving safety. So to start off with, I want to talk about protection. Now this, I'll give you a bit of a close-up, this is a cut resistant glove. Personally, I'm not a big fan of them, I don't like them. And there is a reason for that, and it's an opinion that I think some people share and others will disagree with, and that's absolutely fine. You know, this kind of thing is really down to personal preference. So I am right-handed, so I will normally hold my knife in my right hand and my piece of work in my left. So I would wear something like this glove on my left hand. Now what will then happen is I'm holding this and I'm carving away on a piece of wood, which is absolutely fine, and if I slip, I'll give you a bit of a close-up. See, if I was to slip and run my knife down this glove, and I'm not going to do it hard because I haven't actually tested these. You know, I slip off and I run this knife down here. In theory, this will protect me. Certainly from cuts. It definitely won't protect me from stabbing injuries on something as sharp and pointed as this. But you know, they're there to kind of stop you from being cut. People like butchers and other people that use sharp tools as part of their work tend to wear them for health and safety reasons, and that's absolutely fine. My problem is that as a wood carver, I carve in lots of different places, and as an example, maybe I would wear this glove here in my workshop because that's where I do a lot of my carving. However, if I then go out to the woodlands, which I do very regularly, and I also carve out there quite a lot, I often wouldn't carry something like this. And even if I did, there is a chance that I may be somewhere where I haven't thought I was going to do any carving, and then I do, or I've forgotten to bring it with me. And if I've got used to wearing this, and I've got used to having the odd slip and the odd mishap that this glove has protected me from, if I then try and carve with it, or try and carve without it, should I say, I've kind of got into the habit of going, oh, it doesn't really matter if I do this and I slip because this is protecting me, and all of a sudden I don't have that protection, and that can then lead to more injury, or to injury, should I say. So that's why I'm not a big fan of carving gloves. I think, you know, as a newcomer, it's a bit 50-50 because you don't want to cut yourself and you know, either injure yourself or be put off from carving because of it. But at the same time, if you start out carving with one of these, it's very difficult to get into the habit of carving more safely when you don't have one. So as I say, as far as carving gloves are concerned, I'm not a huge fan. Some people will be. It's really down to personal preference. What I am a big fan of is actually using a bit of sort of common sense and thinking it through before you start carving, and carving as far as is possible so that you're not going to cut yourself in the first place. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring the camera a bit closer in. I'm just going to show you a few things and a few of the ways that I would carve to try and prevent any kind of injury. Right then guys, so here are just a couple of the things that I tend to do when I'm carving, especially if I'm by myself, and certainly if I'm outdoors by myself. You know, if I'm in my workshop, I'm within shouting distance of people. If I'm out having a wander in the woods and I want to stop and do a bit of carving, you know, you generally need to take a bit more care. Even if you're with a group and you've got a first aider with you, you know, you don't have as much access or as quick access to medical services as maybe you would at home. So there's a couple of things you can do, and some of you guys will be aware of this already, and there are a couple of types of cuts you can make that are really helpful. So the first one is called the chest lever grip, and as the name suggests, you have your knife close up to your chest. You hold it, normally you would hold your knife in this manner. a lot of people would do, and you would kind of cut away from yourself, which is a pretty safe way of carving. So that's kind of one of the real basics that I probably should have covered first. And with this kind of carving, you know, you want to try and keep it as controlled as possible. And safety, is, mostly in my mind, is about control. It's knowing where your blade is and also where your blade is going to be when you finish your cut. So you can see that I get to the end of the wood and I come off maybe a couple of inches, and I know exactly, well, very roughly, where that blade is going to stop. If I start trying to do power cuts, all of a sudden my knife is going about a foot away from the piece of wood, which is fine if I'm in my workshop, etc. But you know, if you're around other people or someone walks in front of you without you realising, all of a sudden you're thrusting a sharp blade kind of towards people, which you don't want to do. But going back to the chest lever grip, so your knife, you actually have the base of your hand here up against your chest, and what you're doing is you're turning your knife basically through 90 degrees so it's facing away from your hand. And what you'll do is using mostly your wrist. So if I just move here, you're moving this part of your hand, you're using your wrist to do the work, and you will essentially do this, and you can get some really powerful cuts, he says. This method, a bigger knife probably would have been better, but you could get some really powerful cuts in, and you're keeping this blade in a really controlled position. You can also move the piece of work along with your hand if you want to get more power in, so I can go like this. You can even keep your knife exactly where it is, and you can just move your piece of wood. And that way your blade is barely moving at all. And that's a really safe way of doing it. I find this really good for things like the handles of spoons and things like that when I'm out in the field or in my workshop. The other way of doing it, and you know, if anyone's thinking about, you know, getting their kids into carving or something like that, another really good way is you take your knife, same position, you know, this kind of 90 degrees from normal, and you get the back of your knuckles flush against your leg, you almost lock it in. Take your, you can't quite see me, but you take your elbow and you put that close into your side so your whole arm is locked, you're not moving anywhere. And then again, you take your piece of wood, you keep your knife exactly where it is, and you move the piece of work across the knife. And this is a really nice, safe way of doing it for children, because they're not moving the knife around, they're not accidentally going to hit themselves or others, and it's nice and controlled. And really, for me, those are the two safest ways of carving, especially when you're needing to do kind of longer or more sweeping cuts like this. Now, you will often see me in my videos kind of doing things like this, and you know, I'm not saying that what am I trying to say? It's essentially do as I say, not as I do. And you know, people will get into their own rhythm, they'll find their own way of carving. This is something that I've always done, alongside things like this and alongside things like this. It's just the way I carve. Whether that's right or wrong is up for debate, but you know, you do need to be careful of kind of, if you start out learning to carve, you know, doing this, you know, it's something that will stick with you, and it's very difficult to correct those kind of habits. The other type of thing I wanted to show you about is, especially if you're doing any sort of finer detail work, I like using the back of my offhand thumb on the back of the blade, and you know, this kind of thing, this is a really safe way to carve. It's very difficult, as long as you don't put, say, a finger up here and start cutting towards it, which is obviously a silly thing to do, and I think that's fairly self-explanatory. But you know, it's all about knowing, as I said, yeah, the primary thing about carving for safety for me is knowing what you're doing with your blade, where it is at any one time, and slightly more importantly is where it's going to be when you finish your cut. So I know that my knife is going to stop about here, so I don't want any fingers or appendages. You know, you don't want to come down, you don't want to be carving towards yourself, towards any part of your body at any time. And I often see people doing things like this. You know, they'll put the piece of work on their leg because it's convenient, because it's a nice place to rest. If you haven't got a carving stump nearby, you're just sitting on a little stool, or you know, sitting on the ground when you're out camping, and they go like this, and then people wonder when they get distracted why they've cut themselves in the leg, or they've chopped off a finger or something like that. So that's just another thing to think about. What else was I going to say about this? Distractions while you're carving, that's another thing. One of the things I see very often, especially if I go out camping with a group of people and we're doing a bit of carving, is that you can be sitting there being nice and safe. You're using your chest lever grip. You're using your lock grip on your leg or something like that. Even if you're sitting there and you're doing what I was doing earlier and you're doing nice, gentle, you're not putting too much power in it, your blade's not travelling past sort of your own personal space, if you like. But if there's more than one of you, what are you doing when you go out camping? Well, you're probably having a conversation with your friends, you're probably having a chat about things. You might be keeping an eye on the fire, making sure that doesn't go out, or you're watching a pot to make sure it doesn't boil over. All of these things will impact on your concentration. And what I will say is I appreciate, real life does get in the way, but, where at all possible, try and keep distractions to a minimum. That's one of the main things I want to get across on this, is that I can sit here and I can carve a spoon having a conversation with a couple of friends, and I will be able to keep an eye on what I'm doing and generally be safe. If you're new to carving, trying to do something that you're not familiar with whilst doing other things, can be a recipe for disaster. And all it takes is for you to kind of, you've made a couple of cuts. What am I doing? You've moved it round a little bit, you've come back and you've put your fingertip right at the end of this piece of wood, almost without realising it. I've seen people do this before, and all of a sudden you make this cut, and oh, I've lost my fingertip. Really, really not a good thing to do. Now I'm just going to move the camera back out very quickly to wrap this up. A couple of other things I want to tell you about, and I'll do that in just a second. Right then guys, well I'm almost finished with this one. There was just one other topic I wanted to cover, and I apologise for anyone that feels that maybe I'm being condescending on this. But we all have the opportunity to be idiots, myself included. I've often done silly things while I'm carving, either through just not thinking it through or being in a rush or what have you. So just two more points I want to make is, one, when you're carving, take your time. Appreciate there's a temptation to go, do you know what, I want to turn this into a spoon, I'm going to start trying to get rid of loads of wood really quickly. All that's going to do, or two things. Firstly is, from safety perspective, you've got a much higher chance of injuring yourself or somebody else, and secondly there's a much bigger chance you're going to ruin the piece of work that you're working on. So take it slowly, consider what you're doing, take your time. Secondly, and the most important one I think here, especially if you're someone that goes out camping and bushcrafting, especially if you're with friends, if you're carving, don't drink. I know it sounds really silly and really, really obvious, but the amount of people I've seen who've had a few drinks round the campfire and decided, do you know what, I'm going to try and finish off that spoon I started earlier. It's really, really easy to do. I think I've probably done it myself a few times. And in hindsight, what an absolutely idiotic thing for me to do, because any kind of alcohol, even if you're just slightly inebriated, will restrict your decision-making skills and your reaction times. And all of a sudden, you're kind of looking at it, you're playing around. And again, going back to the example of I'm going to hold it like this. That feels like a comfortable position, and I'm going to cut right towards my hand, and all of a sudden I've got a massive wound on my hand that's probably going to need stitches or something, just because I've decided to do something a bit silly. Actually, just before I finish, and I realise this video's rambled on a little bit, one other thing I want you to show you. And a lot of people will tell you, and generally speaking this is true, is never cut towards yourself. Never put something like that and go like this, never hold something and cut like that. There is one exception to that, and it's a very useful exception if you're trying to do some detailed cuts. Now I'm taking this piece of wood, I'm going to put the piece of wood on my chest, and I'm going to be cutting like this towards myself. Now I hear some of you maybe crying at the screen, no, don't, you're going to cut yourself. Well, there's one very useful type of cut that you can make, and it involves taking your elbow and locking it to the side of your body, really locking it in and making sure you keep contact, you keep it pressed in tight. You're then going to take your knife and you're going to turn it through an entire 180 so that the blade is facing towards you. You can almost use, I'll give you a quick example. So that's how I would normally hold my knife. I'm going to turn it round like this so that the blade is facing kind of my thumb, and I'm going to use my index finger just as a support on the back of the blade. And with your arm locked in, which I'm not even going to bother supporting it, but with your arm locked in, you can cut towards yourself. And actually, it's very, very difficult. Let me kind of crouch down a bit. It's very difficult to get this knife to touch my chest. I can do it if I really, really kind of twist my hand in. I can just get this blade to make contact. But for generally speaking, you know, I'm putting quite a bit of pressure on here. And, you know, this blade is coming nowhere near my chest. So this, you know, maybe you could class this as a slightly more advanced technique if you like, but it's a really, really useful thing, especially in spoon carving, but for other carving as well. You know, I often use this method if I'm trying to make a spatula or a cooking spoon when I'm out in the field. You can get it nice and set in your chest, and you can remove quite a lot of material quite quickly with some nice sweeping cuts, as opposed to doing this. Both of them will work, and to be honest, it's down to personal preference. So anyway guys, I've rambled on long enough. I hope this episode was useful. I hope it's given you something to think about, and I hope you all do really take some heed of this and just, you know, try and stay safe when you're carving, because the last thing you want to do is cut yourself, either have a minor injury or God forbid a worse one. So really, you know, just have a think about what you're doing and keep in mind where your knife blade is going to be at any particular time. So that's it for today. Comments and questions in the box below. Hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I hope you'll all join me next time. Cheers guys.